Okay, so a couple things. One, this is just a quick video of something that was on my mind connected to writing. We're going to talk about the aesthetic aspect of writing just briefly, not the full thing, but this is about the importance of titles and hooks or attention grabbers. If you remember, we discussed this a little bit in the big video about the kind of traditional academic essay. If you don't have a model, you can go back and look at that, but this is just something. Also, it should be noted that I got my shelves reorganized in case you were still seeing the cardboard box, and it should be noted that I'm officially done with my summer session, so the class I was making these videos for initially is over. I'm just in the habit of making videos. So all that being said, I hope you enjoy, and if you stumble across this 3 years from now or something, it was just a habit by now. So here's what I want to talk about: the aesthetic aspect of writing as it connects to just titles. So first, since I don't have other videos about it yet, I call aesthetics is the branch of philosophy that deals with beauty. And so when I talk about it with writing, I'm talking about how we make writing interesting to read. And so how do we make something intriguing? How do we get a reader buy-in? How do we deal with at the language level, in the structure, something? How do we keep it fun and interesting and meaningful to your reader? So there's a couple ways we do that. Usually, the easy ones are traditionally it might be when we talk about things like creative writing or literature, and we're thinking about powers of story and stuff like that. All of that can be applied in any context or genre, but that's when I use the word aesthetics and considering things of beauty, I'm thinking along those lines as far as traditional writing approaches. And so I've talked a little bit about that before in like the 8 aspects video. But the challenge is that those things don't usually get, or shouldn't, depending on your student learning outcomes for an English 101 or 102 class. Usually the emphasis is, those things don't get taught because the emphasis is on rhetoric and composition, or in most institutions it's supposed to be, and sometimes people pull in training from a literature degree or something, and they'll do that instead of the rhetorical. Not that literature can't be rhetorical, so don't get me wrong, I don't want to start a fight. The important thing though is that we don't always know how to apply the aesthetic practices that make writing fun, or make writing fun to read, that are used in creative writing or literature. We don't always know how to apply those in those contexts, in academic contexts. We often, part of that is we're not thinking about our reader as someone who actually wants to read it. We're thinking about the audience of one and someone who's forced to read it, and I've mentioned that a little bit in other places. So it's important to make something meaningful to your reader, but some key places, and kind of what's on my mind right now. Sorry for taking 3 minutes for all of that, but what's on my mind right now to help equip you, whoever you are, or students if they're watching, is when we talk about titles, when we talk about attention grabbers or hooks. So they're really, the basics of an attention grabber or hook is just that. I like to parallel those with a pickup line. So in the same way when you do introductions, you might use pickup lines, but you don't use cheesy ones like "Did it hurt what when you fell from heaven?" Go watch that video if you're interested. You don't use that. You don't want to use cliche things. You want it to be something that draws your reader in. Most people will say that if you're trying to create a good attention grabber, there are at least 3 things you can do. One, you can ask some sort of question that draws your reader in. If you ask a certain question, try to avoid the second person pronoun you, and instead try and shift it to, does a person really need this, that, or the other thing, instead of have you ever wondered, or how often do people wonder about. Like, you make that shift so that it lines up more with academic language, but those questions can still draw in. As a second approach, some people will use famous quotes. The important thing here is not that it's some random famous quote from famousquotes.com or whatever it is. It's that the quote is either from a person who is connected to the topic you're writing about, or the quote is directly connected to the topic you're talking about. Don't do some generic, broad, hyper-generalized quote, because that just looks cheesy. And it's not as interesting. It doesn't engage people as much. As a third option, some people will start essays with, as a hook, they'll use anecdotes, which is like is a story of some kind. Now you have to be careful depending on the genre you're writing. If you're in an academic essay and you use an anecdote, that's a story, but it's a story with purpose. It's meant to lead into something else. If you do too much story in an academic essay, it feels more like a personal writing instead of an analytical paper, an evaluative paper, a research paper. And then your reader starts thinking about it and thinking of you as less complex, less college ready, or something like that. Not because you can't do the other type of writing, but because you've relied so much on story that they can't see the research. It doesn't feel like a research paper. Sometimes that's a good thing. Some instructors tell you do that on purpose, but you should be aware and be intentional about that. But that's an option. So you do a 2 or 3. Usually, I'll recommend no more than like a 2 or 3 sentence story sequence at the beginning that is tangible, concrete, specific to the topic you are going to be leading into. Remember, it's all about setting the parameters early on, drawing in people's interest, and then tightening in to your thesis statement or your main purpose. That's usually where these go. So that's one way that you can incorporate the fun or the aesthetic into an essay, is in that initial attention grabber. You want that to be a place. That is one key place where the point of that first sentence or two is not to make an argument yet. It is to get your reader to want to read your argument. And so you can do that in a variety of ways, and we've mentioned a few of those. In addition, the title is another place. There's a reason clickbait titles work. They sound intriguing, they're hot button, they get people riled up. They're like, oh, I gotta read that because it's blah, 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 or because it's sensationalized. I'm not saying use sensationalized language. I'm saying that it can be rhetorically effective. If you think back, some people will... when we do sensationalized language, it kind of ties back to the classical rhetoric Greek debate between like Aristotle, Plato, and the sophists of the time, who were just like, let's figure out how we can manipulate people. That's kind of what a clickbait title does because it's so sensationalized. But as writers, we can try and, after discovering the truth, as Plato or Aristotle says, we can then, or maybe it's Socrates, now I'm spacing, we can then, knowing that we have a message that's meaningful, we can try and do something rhetorically savvy, rhetorically intentional to get our reader in. And so titles, we can borrow techniques from clickbait titling as long as we also tie in, as long as we don't oversell. That's the important thing. But here's how it works. This video is taking so long. I'm so sorry. We're 7.5 minutes in. But here's how it works. A lot of times it helps to be associative when you're thinking of these aesthetic things. You're not trying to gear necessarily toward logic. You're trying to gear toward someone's emotions or their experiential side. That's the aesthetics. The aesthetic aspect of writing is tying with emotion, experience, often through descriptive language, something like that. So here's how it might work. So here's my example. Say I want to write a paper, which I have, on collaborative writing, and this is it's actually like the second chapter or third chapter of my dissertation. Anyways, say I want to write a chapter on collaborative writing, or writing collaborative writing in the workplace. Well, I could just say my title's Collaborative Writing in the Workplace. That's better than Project 1. That's cool. It's like, at least I didn't say Essay 1 for English 101. That's not your title. That's the instructor's title. You have to come up with something that helps us understand or get a glimpse of where your paper's going. But if I'm writing this collaborative writing in the workplace, that at least names... It signals rhetorically, it signals structurally what my paper's about, but it may not be as engaging. So what I go is, I'm like, okay, collaborative writing in the workplace, it's kind of teamwork oriented, depending on what I'm trying to say about it. So instead of thinking like, what's the scholarship on this, I come up with a secondary title that is maybe more pop culture associated. So I try and just think of, I try and brainstorm it. Sometimes I'll do a mind map on a board or on paper or something like that. And okay, so teamwork. So collaboration makes me think of teamwork. When I think of teamwork, okay, are there songs about that? Are there movies about that? Are there TV shows where this becomes important or where it fails? And so, okay, maybe teamwork, and maybe I like sports, so I think like the NBA, so I think like Larry Bird, Michael Johnson, Michael Jordan, or something like that, or something that's recent and happening. So if, right now I think the NBA finals just finished, so that's kind of on my mind, or was on my students' mind a few weeks ago. So I might think a sports analogy to teamwork and the importance of it and working together. And so I may say, and if I may say something like, it worked for the Bulls, collaborative writing in the workplace, or something like that, thinking Chicago Bulls, or something like that. Or maybe I think like movies or songs, or even maybe I'm just like political things. Right, a few years ago, Hillary Clinton ran on like Better Together, I think, and so I might borrow that, Better Together, collaborative writing in the workplace, and so that might draw some people in, or it might offend people depending on your political leanings, but it may still intrigue them aesthetically. Or I could just go, okay, well, what are big movies about teamwork, more recent, and so it could be like big blockbuster hits last 10 years. And so then I go, Avengers Assemble, collaborative writing in the workplace. So that might be more engaging. It ties to a pop culture reference. It draws a reader in a fun way, and still is sort of associatively connected to the content of my essay or my writing or whatever it is. So when I'm thinking about titles, I don't want to let them just fall flat and say Project 1, Essay 1, or like Summary 1 or whatever it is, or like borrow the title of my main source, a reflection on Aristotle's rhetoric. Like, that's kind of boring. What am I trying to say about that thing, and then what does it associate with? How can I draw people in a fun way and kind of have a sense of humor with it? So you want to think associatively, think song reference. A lot of times you can have kind of a double title where it's like Avengers Assemble, collaborative writing in the workplace, or something like that. So that's kind of how we want to think about titles. That's kind of how we want to think about attention grabbers and as a pickup line or something. So these are just two places, really practical ways that you can make your essay's first impression really solid, is by just trying to grab your reader's attention. I had a student do, she was studying the linguistic components at a bowling alley because she loves bowling, and her title was Bowlinguistics, and I'm like, that's really cool. I geeked out a little bit, and she had some pictures as well, because it's another thing, like just having images in the first place, and you can do that with APA-RMLA. She had pictures, she had that cool title, she had a cool intro line. That's one thing. I had another student who, it was slightly more off color, but she was doing an analysis on her workplace, and there are certain cultural associations. I'm not going to actually give the example. And so she used a sort of, not off-color joke, but, like some would consider slightly inappropriate, depending on age range, joke connected to the type of business she was working at. And so it's one of those things where it's a fine line, so you got to be careful. But you want to try and tie what you're writing with something more associative, if you're trying to make it interesting for a broader audience. So keep that in mind. Again, this is the aesthetic aspect of writing, and so it's just, how can I make my academic writing more fun? Two easy places is the title and the initial pickup line. There are a couple other ways, like vivid and concrete language that just makes someone experience the thing when you're describing something, using that kind of imagery language if possible, not overdoing it, and also just using images as well. These are practical aesthetic practices to enhance the experiential side of your paper, that sort of thing. So keep that in mind. There will probably be more on the aesthetic aspect of writing. I didn't mean for this video to go long. I don't even need to make this video for my class, but I figured it was on my mind. Students were asking about it earlier. It was kind of as they're finishing up their projects. Hopefully it helps somebody have some fun with their writing and come up with cool titles. So, in case I don't post any more for a while, have a good couple weeks or summer. I'm defending my dissertation next week. Hopefully I succeed, or die trying. No, it should be fine. So, enjoy.